Now, over the last year, I've been reporting on the work of forensic historians Alan Wilson and Baram Blackett. The research started in the 1970s and includes the discovery of the grave of King Arthur and many other finds and claims. You can watch all of the previous shows from the richplanet.net website via these links. Now, as described in detail on a previous show, it seems their findings are not welcome by somebody, and evidence points firmly to this somebody being MI5. In August 2011 at 3:15 AM, a sudden violent fire broke out underneath Baram Blackett's bed. He subsequently almost died and was in a coma for 11 days. After recovering from his injuries when tidying up the debris, Wilson and Blackett discovered evidence that suggested the fire may have been started deliberately by the placing of a device under Baram Blackett's bed. Strangely, the fire brigade did not carry out any investigation into the cause of the fire, which is highly unusual. I have been contacted by several people who work in the fire service. All have stated that this is suspicious and that proper procedures were not carried out. Here is a statement I received from an ex-commander of a fire service who is also a qualified fire investigator with 30 years service in the brigade. He states, "I've just watched this week's Rich Planet TV and I might be able to help out a little. I have investigated hundreds of fires during my career, and while I might not be able to solve the whole deal with the fire in question, some things jarred totally with the way things should have happened in my opinion." Whenever there is a fire that results in property damage, the fire service will carry out an investigation. At the very least, the officer in charge of the crews who put the fire out should have taken some time to establish what was the cause of the ignition, what was the item first ignited, and finally, what was the defect or act or omission that caused the fire. I was astounded that crews left the scene in the early hours without carrying out any investigation whatsoever. Given the circumstances of the fire at the time, it must have been a potentially fatal fire. The next level of fire investigation would, in my experience, have kicked in. That would have entailed a qualified fire officer being assigned to investigate the fire. There's no question in my mind that this should have been the case in this instance. That officer would have liaised with police, insurance investigators and any other relevant party to get to the bottom of how the fire started. This can take weeks or even months and will entail a forensic examination of the scene with photographs to establish how the fire started. Witness statements should be taken and the investigating officer should interview relevant people with a view to establish the cause of the fire. I've done this many times following fires in domestic property where there have been no injuries and where there are no suspicious circumstances. So it jars violently with me that the crews put the fire out in the early hours and then left with what must have been the most cursory of investigations. It's difficult to reach a firm conclusion without having examined the scene, but as a rule, the lowest point of burning often indicates where the fire has started. Fire then spreads upwards and laterally, and the arrow of combustion is then said to point to where the fire has started. Liquid accelerants can confuse the matter, running underneath floorboards. If there was any remaining carpet on the floor, liquid accelerant could be indicated by clear lines of burning, charring on the side, and clean carpet on the other side. The extent of charring in the timber joists indicates the possibility of accelerant, or that the fire was burning for a significant period of time. As fire takes hold in the compartment, wall coverings and ceiling plaster will often collapse onto the floor in the early stages, with the advantage to the investigator that digging down under the debris will often reveal a lot of evidence. Was there an explosive device? My own thoughts on this is that they wouldn't necessarily need an explosive device. Was the burned joist under the bed? If so, then you have to ask, how could an accidental fire start under a bed? I'm guessing here, but there is mention of candles. Who would light a candle and place it directly under a bed? Residue from a chemical fire or from accelerants would remain after the fire. Petroleum-based accelerants could easily be identified by detection dogs available to fire investigators. If I was asked to speculate, I would think that perhaps the fire service was warned off. Just put the fire out, lads, then back off and leave it to us. I hope this adds a little to the jigsaw for you, Richard. Sorry I can't be more specific. I'm not from MI5, honest. I'm just a working class lad from Redacted. Please also give my admiration and best wishes to Mr. Wilson and Mr. Blackett for their fine work, and my thanks and blessings to you. Your programme is the absolute highlight of my week. Okay, now, letters were sent to the police by Wilson and Blackett spelling out their concerns that the fire was malicious, but the police refused to investigate the case. So in January 2012, I broadcast details about the case on TV, which forced Northumbria Police to reopen the case. You can watch a full expose of what happened from the richplanet.net website. It's show number 127. Now, the two detectives investigating the case, DS Nick Walker and DC Harry Tuttle, refused to allow the floor to be examined by forensics for traces of explosives or accelerants, even though the damage blatantly looked malicious. Now, after Wilson and Blackett then threatened to have the floor tested privately, the police changed their minds and eventually sent two forensics experts to the property who removed 4 floorboards, put them in evidence bags and stated that they would be having them tested. 12 weeks after this, the police contacted Wilson and Blackett stating that these tests could not be done because they would be too expensive. This was clearly a fob-off, as these kind of tests typically cost around £100 per hour for the lab time. Now, having received the floorboards back from the police, it looked as though the floorboards had been forensically tested, as they had been cut into sections, placed in special airtight nylon bags, and a small hole made in one of the bags which could have been used to insert a probe for testing. This is how these tests are normally done. One person who Wilson and Blackett suspected may have been involved in causing the fire is a young lad called John McNeil. Now, this young man was lodging in the house during the time of the fire, and I recently carried out an hour-long interview with John McNeil, and I'll summarise what he said to me. McNeil had not stayed at the house for a few nights prior to the fire and was at another address on the night. He categorically denies placing any device or being asked to place a device under Baram Blackett's bed. He refutes the claims made about him in a previous show regarding any involvement. And to me, he did seem genuine about these statements. I asked him about the keys to the house because it was claimed that he had lost the keys just weeks before the fire. He acknowledged that he had lost the keys before the fire, but that his mother had recently found them in a cupboard in a sports bag in her house. In a previous show, Wilson and Blackett described some intimidation they had suffered by 2 individuals in a small block of flats that overlooks their property. When the intimidation started, Alan Wilson claimed that one of these individuals, called Alan Parker, was deliberately upsetting Wilson and Blackett's dogs by flashing his strobe light at them. Complaints were raised, and because of the noise created by the dogs, Alan Wilson was eventually fined by a court for this. Now, in my interview with John McNeil, McNeil confirmed to me that Parker did use a strobe light to deliberately upset the dogs. John McNeil also said that on the night of the fire, when he was away from the house, Alan Parker telephoned his mobile phone shortly after the fire started and left a message on his phone telling him about the disaster. In addition, I also asked John McNeil about Alan Wilson's claim that Alan Parker told Alan Wilson that when John McNeil was in Parker's flat sometime before the fire, he had seen some listening devices on Parker's computer screen, and that McNeil asked Parker if it was possible to trigger these listening devices remotely. I put this to John McNeil, and he told me that he did see listening devices on Parker's computer screen, but he did not ask Parker if they could be activated remotely. John McNeil said that Parker showed him the listening devices and told him he was acquiring one so that he could spy on his neighbour. McNeil stated that he definitely did not ask whether the devices could be turned on and off remotely. So if this is the case, why would Parker make this up and say it to Alan Wilson? Another fact which came to light during the conversation with McNeil is that Parker was invited into Wilson and Blackett's house a few weeks before the fire to fix a door they had been having problems with. Parker was in the house for a few hours unattended while fixing the door. McNeil also stated that at least one person had been in the house around this time fixing Alan Wilson's computer. To our knowledge, Alan Parker has not been questioned by the police, and the police have closed the case. On the 7th of November 2012, Wilson and Blackett received a letter from Detective Inspector Dave Culverwell, who was the person allegedly in charge of Detective Sergeant Nick Walker, stating the following: I write in response to queries you have raised personally to Northumbria Police, also through Richard Hall and lately Shi Ongura MP. I remain satisfied with the initial decision that the cause of the fire was not the cause of any criminal act. With respect to your specific query regarding the floorboards, I can confirm that they have not been forensically tested, as there has been no criminal investigation into the matter. So why did forensics team remove the floorboards? Why did they say they were going to be sent for forensic testing? Why did the floorboards appear to have been tested? And why have the fire brigade not carried out an investigation into the cause of the fire? It appears that Detective Inspector Dave Culverwell is probably being lent on to take part in Northumbria Police's crimes and has agreed to pervert the course of justice along with Detective Sergeant Nick Walker by not investigating the evidence correctly. Having looked into these events carefully, it seems the person in Northumbria Police who was instrumental in thwarting any investigation is Detective Sergeant Nick Walker. Now, Baram Blackett claims he was given information by somebody in the legal profession who knows of Nick Walker and said that Nick Walker, quote, jumps through hoops for MI5.
To be honest, it sounds to me like you're trying to find an excuse for this part. Honestly, that's what it sounds like to me.
First of all, I'm not your pal. I'm a police officer.
Okay.
Secondly, I'm impartial. I'm not trying to find an excuse for anything. Yeah. But if you believe there's a big conspiracy, you could also say I'm a member of the MI5. This is all a big conspiracy to whitewash this.
Another point possibly worthy of note is that Walker does not speak with a local accent. Just as MI6 have operatives placed in every foreign embassy around the world, it seems likely that MI5 have their stooges placed in every police force around the UK. The hierarchies of these forces bow down and allow this behaviour by criminal, state-sponsored slugs. Again, I appeal, if you are in Northumbria Police and believe in justice, please contact me in total confidence if you want to share any information about the cancer which is infesting your organisation. Wilson and Blackett themselves would just like to be allowed to carry out their incredible research in peace and report on some very interesting new research they are currently involved with. More details of their current research will be broadcast on Rich Planet TV later this year.